All right, welcome back to a brand new episode of the Bonsai Network podcast. How's it going, Cameron?
It's going pretty good.
Excellent. All right, hope you guys are doing all right out there, wherever you are in the world. Figured for this episode, we'd just kind of, again, shoot the poo to start with here at the beginning. We're going to get into our technique of the week in a little bit here, and then we'll get into everybody's favorite segment, Talk Shit, Get Hit. It'll be a little bit more lighthearted this time around, so we did get some feedback from some people who both liked and disliked our segment in the last podcast, so... Did you just pass gas again?
No, it's the chair, I swear.
Okay, all right. I believe you. All right, so yeah, this week at Eisei-en, we've been hanging out doing a lot of different projects here. It's finally heated up quite significantly.
Man. It is really heated up.
Yeah, what's it like coming from Montana to the southeast?
God, like 75 here is what 90 feels like in Montana.
Yeah, it's the humidity. It's ridiculous here.
I can like not move at all, and I'll just be dripping here. It's
exactly.
Wild.
Yeah, so it's been, I think the high in Celsius has been like 32 degrees, which should be somewhere in the low 80s, I think.
Yeah.
I think that's about right, low to mid 80s. So it's actually quite warm for this time of year. I mean, it heated up instantly because in early May, I think it was like May 7th or 8th, we had 1 degree Celsius, which was like 34 degrees Fahrenheit. So it was this crazy dip that came down. We had to move a lot of the deciduous trees in at that particular point. As a matter of fact, I think I mentioned it, maybe not last podcast, but the podcast before that was happening. So we ended up moving a lot of stuff in, but the temperatures have, really heated up over the last week or so. And because of that, we threw up some shade cloth. So last year I built the shade structure down below, and I'll overlay some video here in the vidcast so you guys can see what we're talking about. But I built those structures last year out of wood. And by the way, people keep asking what kind of wood we're building stuff out of here. It's all pressure-treated yellow pine. That's the typical wood that you're going to get in the southeast, and I think most of the East Coast. If you go to Lowe's or Home Depot, that's the type of wood you're going to get. And being pressure-treated, it can handle the humidity to a much better degree than most other woods. That being said, if I could have afforded it, I would have put up cedar. And it would have looked awesome. The problem with the pressure-treated pine is that it actually warps a little bit because as it dries out, all of the chemicals that have been infused into the wood, evaporate, and the wood sort of shrivels and shrinks just a little bit and warps to some degree. But it still maintains, its structure quite well. So using pressure-treated yellow pine seems to be, the cheapest and best option for down here. But in any case, I built that structure last year out of that wood. And then this year was the first year that we actually threw up shade cloth on that section down there. So we used, we've got it, it's a very, very long segment. So the bottom two areas, we've used 40% shade cloth, which is a little bit heavy, I think. 30% probably would have been better, but it's what I purchased last year, or the first year when we opened the nursery. And we actually had it up here in the upper garden to begin with, and then I moved it down there. So we've thrown the stuff that's really susceptible to sun damage underneath that area of the garden. So stuff like, Japanese maples, for example, a lot of the deciduous stuff, broadleaf stuff has gone underneath that 40% shade cloth. And then the upper section, we've got a new segment of 30% shade cloth that's getting shipped in the next week or two. So we'll install that up there, and we'll put things under there like some of the ponderosas, for example, when it gets ridiculously hot later in the summer, or Doug firs, for example, we'll throw up underneath there. Some of the blue spruces, for example, some of those high elevation trees that don't do well in the direct sunlight and super hot heat, because it will get up to 38, 39 degrees here, which is pushing 100 degrees Fahrenheit and 100% humidity. So
I can't wait.
Yeah, you haven't experienced anything yet.
No. I thought I was just getting acclimated. Like last couple of days, I've been fine to just kind of be out there. We were planting those azaleas, and I felt great just digging away and sweating. I thought maybe I'm reaching a level where I'm comfortable.
No, it's going to get much worse.
The level is just increasing.
Yeah, it was always my favorite time of year in Japan, in August, actually, which is the hottest month of the year. That's when it gets up to 38, 39 degrees in Osaka. But the reason I liked it so much is because, the trees look awesome that time of year. It's a lot of fun. Things kind of slow down a little bit, so it's a bit more relaxed. And then in the evenings, almost every night, there's a matsuri or a festival that you can go to in a different town or a different city. Most of them revolve around drinking lots of beer.
Oh, sweet.
So that was always fun that time of year. And actually on August 16th, I believe it is every year, they have a fire festival in Kyoto. So the whole city of Kyoto on the north, east, and west sides of the city, surrounded by mountains. Only the south is open. So on all of those mountains around the city, I don't know how many peaks there are. Maybe it's 5 or 6. They've actually built on the side of the mountain. They've sort of carved out an area, and
cool.
they've essentially drawn out different characters or shapes out of wood, like stacks of logs that they then set on fire in the evening, and you can see these massive characters light up on the hillsides. And I believe it's on August 16th every year. But it's really, really cool. So if you go, to certain parts of the city, or if you can find a building tall enough that you can get up onto the roof, a lot of buildings will have beer gardens up on the roofs. So you can go up on the roof, sit there, and look out at the fire on the hillsides lighting up. So probably the most famous one is the Daimonji. Dai is a character for big. Yeah, and I think it's up north, I believe, and near Kinkakuji, which is the Golden Pavilion. I believe it's up behind that one. I could be wrong about that. But that one used to be visible from the apartment that I lived in Kyoto, that Nancy and I had in Kyoto for a little while. I was commuting back and forth to Osaka during my apprenticeship for about a year and a half or so. I was up in Kyoto. So we could actually see that, from our apartment. If you, sort of moved off to one side of the balcony and peeked around some of the buildings, you could see it between a couple of the buildings. So I'll throw some, photos up or videos up, over the vidcast here so everybody can see kind of what we're talking about. But yeah, so, it is heating up here. I'm sure it's heating up pretty much everywhere else. Everybody is in the northern hemisphere. So, keeping up with your watering is a big thing. Now, that being said, watering right now, we're watering basically twice a day at this point. Essentially, the way we approach it is in the morning, we water basically everything, regardless of whether or not it's, completely dry or maybe a little bit moist. We water everything around 10 o'clock, 10:30 in the morning. And with all the trees that we have here at the nursery right now, between the two of us, it takes close to, what would you say, an hour to an hour and a half, somewhere in that. Yeah, about an hour to get everything watered. So I'm doing the upper garden here, and Cameron's doing the lower garden. So it takes about an hour to get that done. And then if it's a really bright, sunny day in the afternoon, we'll check everything again around 3 or 3:30 and water basically only what's dry or what we think will dry out by 10 a.m. the next morning. Which ends up being, if it's a really bright sunny day, somewhere between, I'd say probably 50 to 75% of the trees get re-watered again in the afternoon. If it's a bit of a cloudy day, we'll still do the full watering in the morning. And then in the afternoon, it ends up being maybe 25 to 50% of the trees get a second watering. So, we're using Aoki blend for most of the trees here. So that's what we have is basically 50% Akadama, 25% Kiryu, and 25% lava rock. So Kiryu is basically like a river sand, essentially. It's the same particle size as the other elements in the soil. So it's, like a 3/16 inch particle size, I believe, for most of it. So it's pretty free draining. So if you're using a heavier mix, you would obviously want to adjust your watering based on that. But, for us using that mix, it allows the trees to dry out quickly, and then we quench the roots. You get better root growth on the tree and better top growth. So we can close wounds, thicken trunks, thicken branches, produce more ramification, get more backbudding on the trees in a much shorter amount of time using that soil mix, rather than using something like, pine bark and turfus.
I see a lot of that.
Yeah, which I don't recommend that you use. Yeah, turfus is probably one of the worst soil components I think that you can use. It is weird, yeah.
It's got these awkward dynamics about it, I feel like, that kind of contradict each other, especially when it seems so like clayey.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, they're flat, basically, flat pieces, so they sort of compress down on each other. There's no real room for aeration, oxygen penetration to the root system. They stay very, very wet, which if you adjust your watering, you can still use turfus, and some people swear by turfus. Some people love using it, but you really have to adjust your watering, and I don't think you're going to get the same amount of rapid growth out of the tree as you would using something that's a bit more free draining. And if you were, if you didn't have access to that soil mix, Aoki blend, we sell it here at the nursery, but I don't sell it online. You have to come to the nursery and actually pick it up. But there's some other outlets out there like the Bonsai Learning Center in North Carolina. They sell it on their website, so you can buy it from them. But if you don't have access to it, if you're not in the States, or if you're in some remote area, or you just don't want to spend that kind of money on that soil, the best soil component you can get is pumice, just pure pumice. It holds a lot of moisture, but it's volcanic, basically, so it has a lot of aeration to it. It does dry out somewhat quickly, not as fast as pure lava rock would. It's lightweight. easy to move around, and easily accessible. So you can buy a yard of pumice from some suppliers out in like New Mexico for $30 for a yard. I mean, it's crazy. Or you can buy it in big bales from different parts of the country. If you just search online, you'll be able to find it. But just make sure you're getting pumice that ideally is pre-screened, or you screen it yourself when it comes in, because there will be dust in it, and the particle sizes will be different. So you'd want to screen it down, depending on the size of the tree, putting larger particle size up to like a 1/4 inch particle size in the bottom, or maybe even a 1/2 inch particle size in the bottom of your soil, or bottom of your pot. And then, if it's a sort of average, medium-sized to large-sized tree, that middle section up to the top section of the soil, you put the 3/16 inch particle in there. And then if it's more of a Shohin size, you can go even smaller than that, and sort of stratify it, throughout the soil. But pumice is a good catch-all if you don't have access to the other things. But again, you have to adjust your watering to some degree, because a lot of the trees you're watering down below are collected yamadori that are all planted in pure pumice. So, how are you watering those? How are we approaching those?
I mean, it surprised me early on to see how well it retains water, because I always just knew pumice for its like free draining abilities, and it fights compaction, so it holds water really well. So we tend to kind of ease off on it, especially it's been raining a lot.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it has been raining a lot. Although this spring has been less rainy and less cold than last spring.
Oh man.
Yeah, so this has actually been a pretty good spring so far. But yeah, the trees that are in that pumice down there, being newly collected yamadori that have been out of the mountains anywhere from 6 months to about a year, somewhere in that range, they don't have a ton of feeder roots quite yet. So, you water with that pumice being in there, it soaks the pumice up, and there's not a lot of feeder roots to suck up that moisture very quickly, so they tend to stay wet for a long time. So those down there, what are we doing? If it's consistently sunny, probably every other day, once a day we're watering those, but we're misting the foliage, usually twice a day. So early morning and then later in the afternoon, not too late, because we don't want that moisture to sit on the foliage and cause fungal problems overnight, but 4 o'clock, 4:30, 5 o'clock, somewhere around that range, misting the foliage again, sort of treating those guys almost like giant cuttings, basically, particularly the junipers, because, the stomata in the morning are going to be wide open. They're going to take up a lot of that moisture. And in the evening, as they sort of taper off into the evening, as temperatures start dropping down, those stomata open up again. So, misting the foliage helps kind of offset not watering the roots too much. All right, so this brings us to our first ad of the podcast this time around. This time it comes from International Bonsai up in Rochester, New York. Shout out to Bill Valbanis, the owner of International Bonsai. So let's read this ad here. It says, International Bonsai Magazine is the first and only professional bonsai magazine published in the United States. Published by the International Bonsai Arboretum for 42 years, it is edited by bonsai artist, educator, and scholar William N. Valbanis, or Bill Valbanis, as most people know him, bringing nearly 60 years of active bonsai study to each authoritative issue. I actually subscribed to this from the time I was a kid, and then I actually started writing some articles for it while I was in Japan. So it was really cool to, be inspired by the magazine growing up, reading it constantly. It comes out, I think it's 4 issues a year, I believe. But in any case, this great information. It was the only magazine back then. This was sort of like pre-internet days, or like early internet days, so there really wasn't much good information out there. So yeah, that magazine was very cool. It's still very cool. Each issue of International Bonsai contains clear, well-written, and beautifully photographed articles on many topics. Articles by Masahiko Kimura and a beginner's small bonsai course are included, as well as information on caring and refining your bonsai collection. Step-by-step illustrated lessons on how to create your bonsai are clearly presented. Articles from professional bonsai artists in Japan are expertly translated and extensively edited for Western applications. Excellent photos of bonsai exhibitions from around the world are included in each issue, so subscribers can study and see what others are showing. Each issue is a mini lesson on a specific topic. The timeless educational articles make the 161 back copies in high demand for personal bonsai reference libraries. Libraries? Libraries.
Library.
Nancy, we were watching a movie last night, and she was like, no, go back to my history. And I was like, where's the history in Netflix? She goes, oh, it's the library. And I said, you mean library? And then I messed it up today.
5-year-old sounding.
Exactly.
I'm going to the library.
The library today. Many bonsai societies and botanical libraries subscribe for their members. Published 4 times a year, International Bonsai reaches bonsai hobbyists and professionals nationally and around the world. Check us out at internationalbonsai.com. And mention you heard about us from Bjorn's podcast, this podcast
That's
right
us.
here, and we will send you 2 free back copies, a $20 value when subscribing for only $40, or $55 if you're a foreigner.
Yeah.
No, I'm just kidding. $55 if you're in a foreign country, not if you're a foreigner.
Can't forget those foreigner rates.
That's right. So join other subscribers from around the world in learning and enjoying the fascinating art of bonsai. All right.
Oh, yeah.
That was pretty cool.
Nailed it.
All right. Excellent. I actually read through that like 5 or 6 times to make sure that I was reading it correctly and that all the punctuation was in the right spot. So I think that went pretty well.
Oh, yeah.
All right. So this is going to bring us to our next segment. What's our next segment? Oh, Technique of the Week. All right, so for this week on Technique of the Week, we're going to be talking about a technique that we're utilizing actually this week right here at Eisei-en. This is typical for this time of year, and that is doing air layers on trees. Now, what would be the purpose of doing an air layer, Cameron?
Well, you might want to reduce the trunk length or just get a portion that's got good movement. Get a new nabari going, stuff like that.
Exactly. Yeah, that last point is really sort of the main point in doing air layers. So most of the air layers that we're doing here, and we'll explain exactly what air layers are here in a second. Most of the air layers we're doing here are on broadleaf trees. We have some larger Japanese maples that I sourced from actually up in Long Island last year. There's a big grower up there. A field grower, wholesale grower. So I picked up some interesting Japanese maples. We've got a large Eisei-en maple here, Shishigashira, of course, Katsura maple, and then I think just a standard Acer palmatum with very, very small leaves. And then in the front yard, actually planted right in front of the house, we have what's called a Beni Maiko, which means red dancing girl. It's really pretty. It comes out kind of pinkish in the spring. So we'll probably throw some air layers on that one as well. But basically, the point of doing an air layer, what an air layer is propagating off of a larger tree, or it could be a small tree, and you find a section of that tree that's quite interesting, and you want to take that and turn it into a bonsai, but you don't want to turn the whole tree into a bonsai. So what we do is we take simple tools. You can use an X-Acto knife, razor blade. You can use a grafting knife if you want, something very, very sharp. And we find a place on the tree that we want to air layer. So we're looking for something that is, interesting in terms of shape. Maybe, it's a section of the tree where it bifurcates or trifurcates or what's for tetrafurcates, quadrificates. Where you've got 3, 4, 5, maybe 6, 7 branches all emerging from the same spot. We can actually do an air layer right at the base of that and produce a multi-trunk tree. So we're essentially propagating these trees by taking the knife, ringing the area where we want the roots to come out. So say, for example, it's an area where you've got multiple branches coming out of one spot. Right at the base of those, we do a ring all the way around with the razor blade, pushing all the way into the xylem, which is sort of that center hardwood. And then we come down on that branch below that about anywhere from, say, 1 inch to 2 inches, depending on the diameter of the branch that we're air layering. And we'll do another ring down there. And then we'll remove all of the tissue between those 2 rings. So that 1 inch to 2 inch area, we'll actually remove all of the tissue. So the reason we're removing the tissue down to the xylem is because, and this will be a good review for you, I think, is when you look at sort of the structure of a branch or a trunk, you've got the bark on the outside. Then what's right inside of that, Cameron?
The phloem?
Exactly, the phloem. Then right inside of that, you've got the cambium, and then inside of that, you have layers of xylem. So the bark is the protective surface. Then the phloem that's just inside of that is essentially, it's got bi-movement. It moves in both directions, basically. So it's taking water nutrients up from the roots and translocating those to different parts of the tree. And it will also translocate those nutrients from different parts of the tree to other parts of the tree or even back down to the roots. So it's moving up and down throughout the tree. The cambium just inside of that, you can sort of view that as almost like stem cells.
Yeah.
Basically, the cambium produces the phloem on the outside and produces more xylem on the inside. So what we want to do is remove all of those tissues back to the xylem, because the xylem is unidirectional. It takes water and some nutrients up from the roots up to the branches. So if we remove the bark and the phloem, but not the cambium, say we leave the cambium layer on there, you're not going to get root production because the cambium is going to reproduce new phloem on the outside and new bark on the outside of that. It's just going to regrow itself. So you have to go deep enough to get down to that xylem so that it essentially stops that translocation moving up and down via the phloem and also the reproduction of phloem from the cambium. So you stop all of that to the xylem. Leaving the xylem intact allows the water and nutrients to still be transported up through that branch and feed and keep alive the branch that you're trying to air layer off the tree while it produces new roots at that upper ring that you made on there. So you've got to make sure that you're, going all the way back to the xylem basically. And it doesn't mean you have to go super deep into the branch. If you're doing an air layer, typically air layers are done on branches anywhere from like pencil size, maybe up to thumb size, depending on the species of tree. You start getting larger than that, it gets a little bit difficult to get enough root production on the tree, or at least in one season, to get it to take to be able to separate it. But typically we're doing relatively small branches. So going in with a knife, you don't have to go very deep, to hit the xylem, basically, to get through the bark, to get through the phloem, cambium, down to the xylem. The xylem tends to be a bit more of kind of a whitish, yellowish color, sort of. The cambium on the outside of that tends to be kind of a greenish color. And then the phloem on the outside of that, with really young branches, there isn't much differentiation between the bark and the phloem. The bark tends to be very, very thin, particularly when you're dealing with a lot of broadleaf trees like maples, for example. The bark is quite thin. So to get down to the xylem is quite easy. You just punch that knife in, ring it all the way around, take that section out. And then before we do the next step, which is actually attaching a pot and putting sphagnum in there, what you want to do is actually apply something like this, which is Clonex. This is a rooting gel. You'll see this in powder form quite often. It's actually more common to find rooting hormone in powder form, but powder form I don't like because as soon as you water it, all the powder just washes off. Yeah. So we use this Clonex rooting gel and actually apply it at the upper section, the upper ring, where we want the roots to emerge. We apply this there, and then we put sphagnum, wet sphagnum, in a pot attached right at that area there, and keep it moist. And basically this rooting hormone will start to produce roots at that particular section of the tree. So timing for doing something like this is quite important. It's May right now, the end of May. Essentially, you want to wait until the new flush of growth in the spring completely hardens off on the tree before you start doing air layers on the plant. The idea being that all of the nutrients have been transported and water has been transported up through the tree, produce that new flush of growth. You have what's called crosstalk happening in the tree with an interaction with what's called auxin, which is a growth hormone in the tips being transported down into the root system, interacting with another hormone in the roots called cytokinin, which is also being transported back up to the shoots. So you get this sort of backflow up and down within the tree. The growth hardens off, then you do the air layers. Then whatever nutrients are being transported back down at that time of year get stopped at the section where you've created the air layer there, or done the upper ring, and you'll get root production there out of the calices, essentially. So, we're doing this here usually mid-May to the first part of June, somewhere right around that period. As a matter of fact, you spent like 8 hours yesterday doing air layers. How was that?
It was pretty fun. I like it a lot. I just love propagation because plants are really cool. Because just imagine if you just cut around your finger and legs started to grow out of it.
That would be very creepy. But yeah,
it is, and it's cool to think about kind of the plant dynamics and everything. That it's still got the water up, but then it tries to move its sugars down, and it says, "Oh gosh, I have no roots to support. I better make some new ones."
Exactly, and then it produces those.
Yeah.
So we're using. I've done it in multiple different ways in terms of the pots that we use to attach to the branches to create the air layers. So this year we decided to work with air pots or net pots, basically. One reason being is that last year we did some of these air layers with just plastic bags, basically, and they stayed way too wet. And a lot of them actually failed. Depending on the species or the tree that we did it on, we have more or less success. But I think a lot of the failures had to do with the sphagnum actually staying too wet in plastic bags. So this year we decided to do the net pots. They're also very easy to cut and make a hole in the bottom to attach to the tree as well. And then we, of course, backfilled it with wet sphagnum, and we're keeping that moist. So the roots should start forming very, very quickly. Typically in our climate here, because it's hot and humid, we've got long growing season. Usually by around July 4th to mid-July, somewhere right around there, you will know if it's going to work or not. The roots will have really started to form. It doesn't mean you can separate it at that time, but you can check, you can pull some of the moss away and see if the roots have formed. If they haven't formed, you'll see little bumps sort of form around the top section of the air layer where you made that ring. Those are just calluses that are forming, and they're not turning into actual roots, which means it's probably failed. So in that case, you can go ahead and remove that section there. But if you're starting to see roots, cover it back up with the moss, keep watering it through the rest of the growing season. And then typically, particularly with relatively small branches that we're air layering off, you can actually separate those from the parent plant in September, October, in the fall. Is not a problem at all. Now, one cool thing is that most of the roots that are going to be produced in that first flush of new roots with the air layer are going to be quite large, fat roots, relatively fat. So you don't necessarily have to separate in the fall if you're going to have, if you have cold winters, for example, and you're afraid that those plants are going to be out there all winter long. Not really that big a deal because those thick roots that are produced have a lot more starch and sugars and all sorts of stuff in them. So they're less susceptible to frost damage. So you can leave them out, still attached, if you're afraid you don't have enough roots on the air layers at that point in the fall to separate them. And then the next spring, let them flush out again. And then maybe late May, early June, after you get that crosstalk happening in the tree, you get new root production, then you can cut those air layers off and separate them. That's not a problem. If you do have a lot of roots in the first fall, you can go ahead and separate them then. And again, because they have thicker roots, you don't necessarily have to protect them in the winter, but it's not a bad idea. Mm-hmm. If you can protect them, you might as well, particularly because, like I said, most of these trees that we're working with are broadleaf or deciduous. Maples, for example, need a little bit of protection in the winter anyway, so it wouldn't hurt to provide some protection, at or around freezing. It's okay if they freeze, but, if it's going to get down into the teens, definitely don't recommend that you leave them out. But the main benefit in doing this type of propagation versus cuttings versus taking seedlings or any other form of propagation is that when you do an air layer, because you're ringing 360 degrees around the branch and you're putting this rooting hormone on there, typically most trees are going to produce a near perfect radial pattern of roots and a very thin, flat pattern of roots because the roots are only going to emerge from that upper cut. Yeah. They're not going to emerge anywhere in that section where you've removed the bark and the phloem and the cambium. They're only going to emerge from the upper section. So you're going to get a very flat root system, nearly perfectly radial nabari on the tree, and you're that much further ahead in the production and development of the plant as a bonsai. So these are sort of the main reasons why you would want to do an air layer. And of course, when you do an air layer, you're getting 100% genetic match to the parent plant. So you want to find something that's got nice leaves, small leaf size, small internodes, for example, and propagate off of that. Yeah. And as a matter of fact, most of the deciduous trees that you'll see in Japan, particularly the maples, and almost all of the shohin trees, deciduous and broadleaf shohin trees, are produced via air layer. Not so much with like pines and junipers, for example. Most of those are either seedlings or cuttings, depending on the species. But all those short, fat, squat little Japanese maples, for example, or trident maples that you see, shohin-sized trees, Stewardia, any of those plants, they all would have been propagated from air layers. Gives you that flat root system, a wide-spreading nabari, and then it actually produces a really short, fat, widespread base to the tree without requiring a lot of height on the plant in a very short amount of time. And you can also air layer sections off of your other bonsai. Say, for example, you got, we'll just say like an elm, for example, that you really like just the top little 6-inch section of the apex. It's got awesome movement to it. Maybe it's multi-trunk, maybe it's single trunk, but the rest of the tree is kind of straight and ugly. You air layer that top section off, you have a perfect little shohin instantly, and you put it in a very shallow pot because, again, the root system is completely flat, and just develop it from there. So if you're looking to create really good nabari or create, really cool shohin, air layers are your best bet. And at some point, we'll cover this in a BONSAI-U episode. Probably not this year, but we'll do it next year at this time so you actually can see the process of what it looks like and see what some of our successful air layers look like after 1 or 2 or 3 seasons having been separated. So I want it to be a bit more comprehensive, which is why we're not doing it this year for the BONSAI-U series. But figured it'd be good to mention this technique at this time of year since you spent all day working on them yesterday. You know,
getting the techniques.
Exactly, yeah. And it feels good too when you separate them and they've got roots and you have a brand new little plant. It's quite fun.
It even feels good cutting the bark because you can tell when you've gotten right through the cambium. It goes.
Yeah, it's like a little sound that it makes. Yeah.
And the xylem. Yeah, once you got the green off, you're like, oh, this looks beautiful, and just get it far enough apart so it doesn't bridge the cambium and you just get an ugly callus and otherwise you got a beautiful tree.
Exactly, yeah. And there are other approaches to air layers as well. You can do a tourniquet system where you put a piece of wire on and tourniquet that area, and then it'll produce roots over the top of that wire. I typically don't use that technique. I've had much more success with the one that we just mentioned here, but there are other ways to do it. And you can do this, it's called an air layer because you're doing it up in the air. You're suspending these pots in the air. The same technique you can do as a ground layer. If you've got a branch that's low to the ground, you can actually do the same ring, apply the same sort of rooting hormone, and then dip that branch into the ground and cover that section up with soil, and it will root right there as well. I mean, typically we don't do that with bonsai, but if you've got a tree that's got low branches and that just happens to work out, you can do a ground layer. This also works for trees that have awesome structure to them and a crappy nabari. You can do an air layer just above the current nabari, an inch or two up the trunk, wherever it flares the most, and produce a brand new nabari on the tree, and then separate and remove the original root system once you have enough new roots on the plant. So it's a really good way to correct for poorly grown trees. A lot of pre-bonsai that are field grown may have good trunks, may have decent branch structure, but the nabari looks like crap because they were just grown in the field and never really produced properly or worked properly. So doing an air layer like that is a good solution for that problem as well.
Sweet.
All right, so this brings us to our second ad for this podcast. This ad is brought to you by Superfly Bonsai. Bonsai enthusiasts know that using the proper tools, soil, and fertilizer are essential for maintaining healthy bonsai. Superfly Bonsai is your bonsai superstore with everything you need from brand names like Kiku, Potted Tree, Gadgetry, still love that name, Mucko, and Samurai Tools. They carry premium quality premixed soil and substrates from the U.S. and Japan, including Akadama, Kiryu, Kanuma, Hyuga, Lava, pumice, and more. So all those components that I mentioned earlier, you can buy them separately from Superfly on their website, and they'll ship it to you. I believe they ship the soil, and then you can mix it together in whatever ratio you need. Superfly Bonsai also has a wide assortment of pots made from mica, plastic, and ceramics from around the globe. Become a Superfly Bonsai VIP member and earn points with every purchase to redeem for discounts and free products. Browse their enormous Harrisburg, Pennsylvania showroom and nursery in person, or shop online at superflybonsai.com and take advantage of the free shipping on all retail orders over $99. Enter Bjorn10OFF at checkout to receive 10% off your entire order. That's BJORN, the number 10, off, OFF, at checkout to receive 10% off your entire order. Pretty cool.
Nice.
Yeah. I mean, I feel legit that we got some sponsors for this. This is
and
pretty
now we
cool.
got codes.
Yeah, we got codes and everything. Man, that is so cool. All right. So this is going to bring us to everybody's favorite segment of the podcast, Talk Shit, Get Hit. All right, so welcome to Talk Shit, Get Hit. In this week's segment, we're going to keep this a little bit more lighthearted, less serious than before. So a couple years back, actually in the fall of 2016, so almost 4 years ago, that's crazy, I started doing the vlog series. For those of you who haven't seen it, I'll put a link in the description down below to our YouTube page so you can check the vlogs out. But basically, it's me acting like an idiot, holding the camera out in front of myself, looking like a total moron.
Full millennial.
Exactly. Oh my God. Yeah. I feel so stupid every time I film myself, and I always make sure that no one else is around. And I just feel like a total moron. But in any case, I started doing these vlogs in Japan, and I think in early 2017, so just 2 or 3 months after I started the vlogs, I put out a video called the $200,000 Bonsai. So it was about this Shinpaku juniper at Fujikawa-san's nursery that was, it was originally a sonare, which is a percumbens juniper. Not a procumbens nana like what you find at your home garden store.
Classic.
It's a true procumbens, yeah, and collected from the mountains in Japan. Unbelievable trunk, beautiful tree. There are photos of it in the kokufu as a procumbens, and then it was grafted. Fujikawa-san's father purchased the tree, and then, or maybe Fujikawa-san purchased the tree, and then had it grafted by a specialty nursery with really fine Ito-Igawa foliage. Actually, in my opinion, the foliage is too fine for the size of the tree. The trunk is really chunky, and the foliage is just like super soft little clouds on the plant. It's actually a very difficult type of Ito-Igawa to wire and make it look nice. And that was one of the things that I noticed in the comments on that video was that people didn't like the way it was styled. Well, with that type of foliage, it's about the only way to style it. There are limitations with juniper species and really with all species of conifers in terms of how you can create pads and place branches, depending on the coarseness or fineness or makeup of the foliage. So that tree, it ended up, somebody had a really cool comment that I thought was funny. They said, it looks like you put a poodle on a wild beast or something, which it sort of does look like. And I'll put a link to this particular video in the description down below so you can see what we're talking about here. But the trunk is all gnarly and crazy, and then you've got this really soft foliage that's almost too cloud-like. So some people don't like the contrast, but it's really all you can do with that type of foliage. But in any case, I put this video out, I think it was early 2017. And then, it got a few views on like 10,000 or so, which is normal, I guess. And then in May of that year, I was on the road traveling somewhere, sitting in an airport. And at that time, I had an app on my phone called YouTube Studio, which is like the behind the scenes analytical stuff that goes on your YouTube page. And I had the notification set up so it would send me a notification every time somebody commented. So I was sitting in an airport and I started getting dozens and dozens and dozens of comments, like back to back to back to back, which never happens. And I thought, what the hell's going on? So I pulled up the video. Somebody must have shared it on some big platform somewhere. Okay. And it went from like 10,000 views to 100,000 views to I think 500,000 views in like a day and a half.
Oh, man.
It exploded. And then over the last few years, it's gotten more and more views, and now it's at like 1.8 million, which is pretty good for a bonsai video. It's the most viewed bonsai video that I have on my channel.
Hell yeah.
There's some other channels like Bonsai Empire that have some with like 5 million views, which is 5 or 6 million views, which is nuts. But in any case, when I was making those vlogs, like I said, this was one of the first vlogs that I made. I picked the crappiest possible music that I could find and put it on there.
It was like work safety video music.
Yeah, well, so I didn't want to pay for music at the time because I didn't have any money at the time. Yeah. So I was like, okay, I'll look for copyright-free music that I can use, no problem online, and it's all just garbage, garbage music. But I was like, okay, I'll find the coolest thing I can find and then put it on there. And at the time, I was watching a lot of Casey Neistat videos. You familiar with him?
Sounds vaguely familiar.
Yeah, he's sort of the guy who came up with the modern way of vlogging, I guess. He's a film producer, film creator, content creator on YouTube. Really interesting dude. And I like the way he did his videos, so I did that same format but with bonsai. And his videos tend to have really loud music in them, but really good music choices. So I tried to find stuff that was as close to that as I could, but it still sounded awful. And I had the volume turned up way too high. So I ended up getting a boatload of comments about how crappy the music was on this video. And these are just a couple of comments here. This one comes from a fella named Mark McDonald. He says, great tree, terrible video. I guess it's just
Shots fired.
Yeah, geez. That's not even a comment on the music. That's just a comment on the video itself. I actually did a lot of jump cuts in there too, which look really stupid now that I look back on it. But I was trying to go for that sort of frantic, sort of Casey Neistat style, and sort of purposefully amateur.
Okay.
That's kind of what I would describe his style as, and that's what I was going for. I can film and make things look artistic and beautiful and awesome, but I thought, okay, let's try out this style. Because it's actually, you have to, I think, know how to frame things properly and do all that first. Then you can sort of step back. It's like learning how to wire a bonsai. You have to learn how to detail everything first, and then you can figure out how to subtract wire away. So you use less wire to get a similar result or even better results sometimes, So it's sort of that vein, I guess, with the video. Somebody else commented here, most inappropriate music ever. And looking back, I agree with that 100%.
Most inappropriate. What about like Cradle of Filth on like a puppy funeral video or something.
Oh yeah, that probably would have been even worse. Yeah, definitely. This one's
hyperbole.
good. They said $200,000 bonsai and $2 music. No, free music, $0 music.
Oh, man. That is beautiful.
And this one's my favorite. In regards to the music, it says, "Wow, your choice of music sense is so ... white." This is true.
You are white.
I am. I would like to think that, my music choices have gotten better in recent videos, but I also have gotten some comments in the last couple of videos. People are like, "This music is awful. Take it up." But everybody's got their own preference.
Yeah, true.
Like if it were up to me, I would be putting on, full on death metal into this. I think the contrast is fantastic, and not like just chugging death metal. I want like syncopated, highly
not just with
a lot of musicality to it. Yeah, not that kind of stuff. No, something a little different than that. But I think people would turn the videos off. Yeah. So, but in any case, those were the comments on the music there. Now, in regards to the video itself. At the very beginning of each of these videos that I used to do, I would go out on my days off, like to Kyoto or somewhere in Japan, and I'd film, interesting places and then do like a time lapse of it. So, in keeping in that vein of sort of amateurish videography, what I would do is find interesting people and sort of guerrilla style film them without their permission.
Guerrilla style?
Yeah, I turn the camera on, I hold it down by my side. And it was recording them from weird
upskirt.
angles. Well, no, okay, not like that. But in any case, I was in Kyoto. There's a shrine there called Yasaka Jinja. It's on Shijo Street, 4th Street, sort of downtown. Very, very old shrine, Shinto shrine there. And I was out in front of that shrine, and there was a monk that was standing. There was a young monk, and every once in a while you'll see monks standing around, holding a tin cup with their hat on, asking for alms or whatever. Is that what it's called, alms?
I think.
Yeah, or sort of not begging for
alms
money.
Might be for, yeah. Otherwise,
like
alms
that.
are for charity, but either way, it is charity.
Yeah,
you're giving
so
money,
you're giving
but,
money to the monks, and they're not begging; they're just standing there with the cup, and they usually stand perfectly still. Sometimes they'll chant some sort of saying or something. So there was a monk that was standing out front there, and there are thousands of people around. This is a very famous shrine. So I was trying to guerrilla film this monk, and I was going to film them, as I walk up and put money in the monk's cup. And, I wasn't looking at the monk. I was looking at how am I going to do this without the monk noticing that I'm filming and without, other people thinking it's weird that I'm filming. So that's all I was focused on. I wasn't looking at the monk necessarily in the face, figuring out the facial expressions or anything. So I had the camera down there, filmed it, posted it online. And then I started getting a lot of comments about the monk at the beginning looking like a white girl, right? And I thought, well, that's strange. So I went back and looked at it again in more detail. I think it is a white girl that's out there begging. And a lot of people were like, she's not even saying anything that is like a Buddhist chant. She's saying something like harami, which harami is like a type of meat in Japan. So it might have been some scam, I guess. Yeah, it was very strange. And it probably wasn't an actual monk, but a lot of people commented on there. They said, any monk that asks for money is fake. Just some random dressed up as a monk. That's not necessarily true.
Yeah, that's
how
a great deal of Buddhist monks operate.
Exactly,
They're forbidden from having a profession, so they need to collect alms or food from the society around them.
Yeah, and then this other person said, "What's up with the white girl beggar?" at the beginning of the video. So yeah, it was very strange, but maybe she was legit, and maybe it was just a very effeminate man. I don't know. It was a younger person with I think maybe a shaved head, possibly. I haven't watched the video in a long time.
This day and age, we can't go jumping to conclusions.
Exactly. Yeah, so I have no idea.
Did you just assume my race?
Oh, my God. We're not going to go down that route on this podcast. All right, so just a couple more comments here that I thought were quite funny. So this was more sort of about the styling of the tree. Someone said, trimming dank bud is most people's bonsai. So there were a lot of marijuana comments on the video. People asking if you could make bonsai out of marijuana, which I don't think you probably could.
It depends on how you keep them from flowering, or if you revert them after they flower, you can flower them, take it off and stuff. Because, you know, I used to work as a trimmer back in the day at a medical producer, and I would always listen to bonsai podcasts and stuff. So they do go hand in hand, but I feel like it's not terribly conducive because it is herbaceous.
Right.
So,
they don't get woody, right?
Yeah. Unless
really lignified.
I've seen like mother plants that are like 20 years old and they look a little woody, but they're still kind of soft, fleshy the whole way through. So it's probably hard to wire. More clip and grow, I would think, but...
Yeah, I remember transporting a bunch of maples across the country and thinking, if we got pulled over, the cops probably.
I'm always worried if I have one out on my porch or something, or just recently, you know, with my neighbor getting busted and whatnot. It was like, I'm worried they're gonna be like, well, he's got a pot plant on his porch, take him away, and I'd have to like prove to them, sir, this is Acer palmatum. Like, it's woody, it's terribly grafted, you can tell, and.
Exactly. Yeah. So, but there are a lot of comments on there about, you know, being able to turn marijuana. So if there's anybody out there listening to the podcast that has done it, send us an email, show us what you've done. I think that'd be kind of cool. So, and then the final comment here is also about the styling. Someone said, and by the way, if you want to insult a bonsai professional, this is the number one insult. We'll say this is the number 2 insult. The number 1 insult is this juniper a tanuki? Right. If you want to go to a bonsai professional nursery in Japan and piss off the owner of the nursery more than anything and like get their hackles up, you ask them if a juniper, like this juniper you're looking at, is this tree a tanuki? They'll be very upset. It's such a taboo in Japan. And for those of you who don't know what a tanuki is, it's where you take a piece of dead wood, completely dead, you take a live whip of a tree, you carve a groove in the dead wood, smash that live whip in there, and then develop the tree. It's essentially cheating. And I've done a whole podcast, or I at least answered some questions about my beef with tanuki on a previous podcast, so go back and check that out at some point.
Man, I see people on the internet weirdly commonly almost advocating for, like, it seems like political correctness for tanukis. They're called phoenix grafts, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's like, well, unless you're conveying it as being a venerable,
exactly,
really
and that was the beef.
Tree.
Yeah, that's where the taboo comes from, is because the junipers, the old collected yamadori with the crazy deadwood that are old and real, those are sold for crazy amounts of money in Japan and all over the world. So the idea with creating a tanuki was to create something like that then you could sell for that same price and cheat people out of money.
That's the deceptive aspect.
And that's why it's called tanuki. Tanuki is a raccoon dog. It's a real animal. I've seen them.
Balls.
Yeah. Well, in real life, they don't have giant testicles, but
true.
The mythical version of them, and when you see them, created as statues, they've got giant testicles.
Draped over their shoulders.
Yeah, and I don't know exactly why they have those. I'm sure there's some part of the story. But in any case, in folklore, tanuki are deceptive. They're deceiving. That's why those trees are called tanuki in Japanese.
I hear that as a reason why we shouldn't call them that. They're like, because it has negative connotations.
It should have negative connotations.
Yeah, the tree is
That's the
deceptive,
point. That's the point. Right? So that's the number one thing that you could say to piss off a bonsai professional. The number 2 thing is this comment: you are basically a hairdresser.
Oh, I've heard that too.
Yeah.
Like, what, you just sit there, do hairdos, just clip it all up and stuff. It's like, yep, that's all I do. That's all I'm learning to do.
Exactly.
I just sit around.
Yeah, there's nothing more involved than that.
There is no art.
Just shearing back.
Yep.
And then the comment just below that comment was, you gave that bonsai a multi-layered bowl cut. Which I could sort of see with that particular tree. Like I said before, that foliage
is it real domey?
It is, yeah. The apex is very domey, and then the individual pads on that tree, because the foliage is so fine, you really have to create smaller pads on the plant with it. The way the branch structure is set up, it wasn't conducive to creating big, sort of voluminous pads. So it looks like, a multi-layered bowl cut, basically. So I get the sentiment. It's not my favorite tree that I worked on.
Hair.
With your hair?
Yeah, I should do a multi-layered bowl cut.
You should do the front really short. Like you're in a mental institution to keep your bangs out of your eyes.
Yeah.
I think that would work.
That'd be sick.
I think you should shave your head and keep the beard.
I was thinking.
Yeah. Since Nancy won't let me grow the beard, and she won't let me get a damn haircut either, I'll grow my hair long. You grow your beard long.
Okay.
I'll keep shaving the beard. You shave your head.
We'll be complementary.
We'll be yin and yang.
Yeah, exactly.
I like it. Yeah, that's perfect.
There we go.
All right, so this brings us to the last segment of this podcast, and that is the mailbag here. We're going to answer questions from BONSAI-U patrons. These are people who have donated to BONSAI-U, which is our online video platform where every other Thursday we put out a new video about a technique or how to style a tree, grafting, watering, all sorts of different stuff. So again, there'll be links in the description down below so you can go check out those videos. You can like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And then if you want to donate, there's a link there as well. You can click on that and donate. It helps us keep BONSAI-U going forward because we do everything in-house here ourselves. I set up the lights here. We set up the microphones. I record this. We get up every once in a while, stop the recording, restart it. I edit it. We put all this stuff together. So the people who actually donate and support our efforts here, we'll answer your questions in the mailbag. So this is for patrons only. So this first question in this mailbag comes from Tom Gamble. He says, how do I best prune the new growth on a Japanese larch?
How to recognize different types of trees from quite a long way away. Number 1, the larch. The larch. And now, number 3, the larch.
Beech and or Japanese maple. All right, so Japanese larch is not something, and larch in general is not something that I know anything about. It's way too hot down here where we live in the south to have larch. In Osaka, it was the same temperatures as here. So the Japanese larch in Japan, the furthest south you're really going to find those is Aomori, which is way north. It's the prefecture that's just under Hokkaido. It's at the very top of Honshu there, and then further north into Hokkaido. So I think I've only ever seen a Japanese larch. They call them karamatsu in Japanese. Kara in this case is the same as the kara in karate, so empty. Or air, basically. So empty matsu, which is pine, is what it translates. It's an empty pine, basically. But I've only seen a karamatsu in the kokufu once or twice in old books, not in person. I've never actually seen a Japanese larch bonsai in person. So I know nothing about those. So I don't want to give you wrong information on those. But with the beech are quite a cool tree. You've got American beech, European beech, Japanese beech as well. So I'll just give you sort of the rundown with the Japanese beech, and my guess is that these techniques would be applicable to European beech and American beech as well. There are a couple ways to approach it. So in the early spring, if you're working with a tree that's already pretty well ramified, or you're moving into that sort of refinement stage, what you want to start doing is reducing the internode length on those trees. With deciduous trees, the goal is to have shorter internodes and smaller leaves. So to reduce the internodes on a beech, one of the best ways to do it is to actually break those buds. The buds that are coming out in the spring, or even before they come out, they're elongated, very long and pointy. Just before those buds, or as they start to swell, before they start to pop or anything, you crack those in half. It sounds scary, but if you crack those buds in half, it will produce a little bit shorter internode and sometimes smaller leaves on the tree as well. I'm not exactly sure, physiologically why that happens, but there's some very, very good practitioners in Japan, a fellow named Oishi, who's a really interesting guy. He's got a very raspy voice. I think he may be retired now, or he's kind of winding down a little bit. But he's really interesting guy, very, very talented with working with deciduous trees and beech in particular. A lot of the most famous beech that you'll see in Japan came out of his nursery as air layers, coincidentally. But he developed this technique of pinching those buds back and producing shorter internodes. That, again, is if you're a little bit further along into the refinement stage of the tree. If you're developing the tree, trying to thicken branches, thicken the trunk on the tree, allowing those shoots to elongate in the spring is a good idea. Again, for the same reasons that we talked about with the air layers, you're allowing that crosstalk to happen. If you're pinching back everything too early in the spring while the tree's in development, you're not allowing that native auxin that's in the tips of the branches to be translocated or brought down to the root system of the tree to produce better rootage on the plant. So you end up possibly weakening the tree if you do that from an early age, or at least stunting the growth to a degree where you're not going to produce a thick trunk or thick branches in certain areas if you want to do that. So in those cases, it's better to allow those trees to elongate to 6 to 8 leaves on each shoot, and then typically cut back to 2. Now here's the key. When you're cutting back, these are alternating leaf pattern trees. So you've got the shoot and the leaves alternate down the length of the branch. When you're cutting back on alternating leaf pattern trees, typically the very first leaf on each of those shoots is misshapen. Okay. Have you noticed that?
Is it because it's a little susoba?
It's a susoba, yeah. It's something in Japanese called a susoba, which is, it translates basically to budless leaf. So that first leaf on the shoot is usually smaller, misshapen, and there's no bud at the base of the leaf where the petiole meets the shoot itself.
It's like round.
Exactly, usually a rounder shape, right? And as you know, beech leaves are a little bit sort of longer and pointier. And this is true with most of these alternating leaf pattern trees. You're going to have that susoba as the first leaf. So you don't count that leaf in the 2-leaf count. You start from the second leaf. So you're technically leaving 3 leaves, but only 2 of those leaves will have buds at the base. You can, on a tree that has a lot of ramification on it, you can remove that susoba. It's not serving any purpose. And if you have a full canopy on a tree and you remove that susoba, cut back to the first 2 leaves, then remove that susoba, it'll actually allow a lot more light to penetrate to the interior of the tree. It doesn't sound like it would, but surprisingly, it allows a lot of light to the interior. This is particularly true with really well-ramified Prunus mume, flowering apricot. We used to do this all the time in Japan, but beech are the same way. But in any case, you want to cut back to those first 2 leaves with dormant buds. Now, if the internodes are ridiculously long, you might want to consider cutting back to the first leaf with a bud at the base, right? That pushes the internode back just a little bit, so you're not getting too long of an extension on the branch, and helps force things back. If the internodes are really, good, nice and small, nice and tight, and you don't want to cut back to the second leaf because that new bud, when it puts out the new branch, is going the wrong direction, you may want to cut back to the third leaf. Right? So you got the susoba and then 1, 2, 3 leaves, and that third leaf will have the new bud going in the right direction. So this is, sort of clip and grow directional pruning on the tree. So it's situational. It depends on your goal with the plant, depends on where it is in its development, and it depends on, how quickly you want to thicken things or produce ramification, things like that. Now, another thing to consider with the beech is that most of the time the leaves are relatively large. You should be selecting for a tree with small leaves if possible. The leaves are relatively large. So what do we know about large leaves, Cameron? What do they do on a deciduous tree?
Well, they block things and they transpire more than smaller leaves.
They do both of those things. And the larger the photosynthetic surface, the more it's going to feed that particular branch that it's attached to, because it's producing food via photosynthesis right there. So you're going to get fatter, uglier branches. So the bigger the leaves, the fatter, uglier the branches are going to be. So to help offset that, you can't really defoliate beech. They don't respond very well to partial defoliation or even full defoliation. You're going to get some big leaves popping out in some areas, some small leaves in other areas, and then branches dying back in other areas. So to get light to the interior of the tree and to reduce that photosynthetic surface on the plant, you can take, after you cut back to the first 1, 2, or 3 leaves, depending on the situation, you can take those remaining leaves on the outer canopy of the tree, fold them in half on that sort of central axis of symmetry, and then cut them on a backwards angle. You can cut them down to half or 1/3 or 1/4 of their original size, depending on how big those leaves are. That reduces that photosynthetic surface, right? So when you cut them on that backwards angle, you open them back up, they essentially still have that beech leaf shape. Right? If you cut them on the wrong angle, they're going to look weird. If you cut them flat, they're going to look flat cut.
Batman
So if you cut them on that sort of backwards 45-degree angle, it gives you a similar leaf shape when you release those leaves. That reduces that photosynthetic surface. It doesn't hurt the plant at all. It really doesn't weaken it per se. I guess technically it does. It produces less food for that particular branch on the tree. But that's the goal when you're getting into ramification development on a deciduous plant like that. Smaller branches or smaller leaves produce smaller branches, makes for a better winter silhouette on the tree, right? And you want to repeat this process, throughout the growing season. So you get the first flush to the end of May, cut back, you get another flush probably through mid-July or so, cut back again, another flush into say August, late August or so, cut back one more time, depending on your winter situation. You have to have at least a good, I would say, 6 weeks between the last time you cut and the first frost that you're going to have, at least 6 weeks for that last flush of growth to harden off. And this is sort of the misconception with fertilizer actually in the fall. People say use a 0-10-10 in the fall, no nitrogen, because you don't want the trees producing new growth that doesn't harden off before it goes into dormancy. Well, it's not technically true. Nitrogen doesn't cause bud break. All it causes is elongation of internodes and larger leaves on the tree on buds that have already broken. Pruning, on the other hand, is what causes bud break. So if you prune a deciduous tree like a beech too late in the fall, before the tree goes dormant, it's going to try to flush again. And then you run into problems with it not hardening off before it goes dormant. So that last cut that you make on those trees, the latest it should be is a minimum of like 6 weeks before you think the first frost is going to be. Ideally before that, if possible, right? So our first frost here, typically the earliest is like, late October. Although this last year we got down to 15 degrees Fahrenheit in mid-October, I think, which is ridiculous. That never happens. So the weather's all sorts of messed up right now, but just keep that in mind. But that's how you would prune a beech, and a lot of your other deciduous material as well. Japanese maple, on the other hand, again, there are two approaches to it. So one approach would be for trees that are a bit more refined, moving along in that direction. You want to shorten the internodes, keep the leaves relatively small. You'd want to pinch back to the first pair of leaves just as that new fleshy growth starts to open and you start to see that new bud in the middle. You pinch that back, essentially similar to the beech, although you're doing a little bit later in the spring than a beech, and that forces the internodes back to some degree. If it's a Japanese maple that you want to produce thick branches on or a thick trunk, you let some of those shoots elongate, potentially all growing season, 2 growing seasons, 3 growing seasons, depending on how thick you want that branch to be. So again, it just depends on the stage. Now again, with Japanese maples, they're similar to beech in that they really don't respond well to partial outer canopy defoliation, which we covered in last podcast. So you got to be extra careful with that. Again, with Japanese maples, if you're pinching back to the first pair of leaves, you have just the 2 leaves there. So on Japanese maples, they're an opposite leaf pattern tree rather than an alternating leaf pattern. Right, so you're cutting back to that first pair of leaves, and then if the canopy is still too full and you want light to enter to the interior to produce back budding or keep those back buds alive, you can cut 1 leaf off in each pair. It's not technically defoliation, in my opinion, because you're not inducing a second flush of growth. When you cut that 1 leaf off in each pair, the 2 buds that are at the base of each of those petioles, the one that you cut off, the leaf that you cut off, that bud is not going to then be activated to grow. It's going to sit dormant until the next spring. So you're not inducing a second flush of growth, so technically it's not defoliation. If you were to remove both of those leaves, it would likely try to put out the new flush of growth there in that same growing season. And again, if you do it on the entire tree, you may get some leaves popping out, some not popping out, some with large leaves, some with small leaves, and it just destroys the energy balance. So that's why you don't want to do it on a Japanese maple. And again, if you cut 1 leaf off in each pair and the canopy is still too full to allow light to the interior, that remaining leaf right here, you can fold it just like the beech, cut it in half, open it back up, and you've reduced that photosynthetic surface by about 50%. So all total, you're getting almost 75% more light to the interior of the plant. Right, and this is to keep those back buds alive and make the tree back bud further, if that's one of your goals. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah.
We'll cover that in an episode of Bonsai-U probably next spring as well. We've got a whole bunch of other videos already filmed and ready to rock and roll for this year, but next spring we'll cover a lot of this stuff in those videos as well. So did I miss anything on the Japanese maples?
It's a great question.
Yeah.
I'm just a learner here.
All right. Okay. This next question comes from a good friend of mine, Steve Iwaki. Shout out to Steve. Steve actually came on our Japan Bonsai tour this year for the Kokofu back in February. Yeah. Steve's dad was a big promoter and proponent of bonsai in California back in the day. And he had a fantastic bonsai collection, promoted the art all around California. And I can't remember if he immigrated to the States or if he was first generation born in the States. But he was one of the first sort of group of Japanese individuals to promote and bring bonsai to the U.S. So, shout out to Steve, shout out to Steve's late father as well. But this question comes from Steve. He says, I hope you and Nancy are well. We are doing excellent. Thank you. This year, a few of my Kishu Shinpaku junipers have yellow tips on 90% of the foliage. I've never experienced this before. Is this due to seasonal changes or fungus-oriented or something else? What do you think, Cameron? What would be your first guess?
Oh, boy.
It's a test.
Oh, God. I don't know. Yellow tips sounds like, either some sort of, like, blighty stuff or otherwise, I don't know. Yellow always says to me something wrong with nutrient flow, but
could be, yeah. It could. I would say it's one of 3 possibilities. So first, like you said, fungal issue like tip blight. It's also called phomopsis. Kishu typically aren't that susceptible to phomopsis. The number one species that I've seen get phomopsis is Rocky Mountain junipers. I mean, it is just a constant battle with those, particularly in an environment like this where it's pretty humid in the spring. Phomopsis is basically, I mean, it's tip blight. So the tips will turn kind of a yellow-brown color, desiccate, and then fall off. So you lose all of your growth on the plant for the year. You can treat this with something called Mancozeb, which you can get at basically any Home Depot or Lowe's, or you can get it online. I think the website's called doyourownpestcontrol.com or something.
Oh, that sounds safe.
Yeah. But you can get that stuff online. The second thing it could be is a nutrient deficiency. So usually with yellowing of the foliage, usually it's a micronutrient issue rather than a macronutrient issue. So the macronutrients are going to be, your nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So that NPK that you see on all of your fertilizer bags. All the micronutrients are going to be things like, zinc, copper, molybdenum. What else?
Iron comes to mind with yellowing.
Exactly. Iron, things along those lines. So I would start supplementing. I would spray with Mancozeb to start with, and I'd also start supplementing with like liquid kelp, for example. You're going to get a lot of those micronutrients out of that. Most of the organic fertilizers that we use, like BioGold, we've been using something called Grow Power here, has a lot of micronutrients in it. Grow Power is really cool. It's got humic acid in it as well, which is great for plants. It really greens things up. This is the first year we've been using it, and the results, I think, have actually been really good. The stuff breaks down nicely. It seems to feed the plants quite well. So I'd start supplementing with something like that, or foliar feeding with liquid kelp. Now, the issue is if it is a fungal issue and you start foliar feeding, you're going to exacerbate the fungal issue. So you might try avoiding spraying liquid kelp on the foliage and just drench the root system with it to start with. And then once the foliage starts looking better, then maybe you can start applying that to the foliage. And then the final thing might be drying out of the foliage. I don't know what soil you have the stuff in and what your watering regimen is. But sometimes desiccation of the tips can be from underwatering and overexposure to the sun. That's a possibility as well. Usually junipers this time of year, all junipers are going to drop their interior foliage, particularly Kishu. They're notorious for this. They'll drop the interior foliage in favor of external growth as a way to sort of offset transpiration. That's just a natural shedding process on the tree. In your case, you're saying all the tips are turning yellow. That's a bad sign. If the interior growth is turning yellow, not that big a deal. It's normal. If the tips are turning yellow, it's probably going to be more of a fungal issue or micronutrient deficiency. So I would try, adjusting all three of those things, watering, and then spraying with Mancozeb, and then also adding some micronutrients, and then see if the tree bounces back at that point. All right, so this last question comes from Colette Green. She asks, I've heard on many occasions that suckers should be eliminated. I acquired some old azaleas from a neighbor. They have substantial trunks with some suckers or sprouts at the base. They are pliable enough to tack down to the soil. Can or will these develop into viable roots / nabari? Okay, so this kind of ties in a little bit with the ground layer discussion that we talked about earlier. So it sounds like you're talking about pushing these down into the soil and producing roots on those. You can do that, but all that's going to do is provide you with a ground layer that then you can separate from the parent tree. It's not going to turn into viable nabari for the plant. With azaleas, they are laterally dominant. They're like a bush. So the apexes tend to be weak. So if you allow those suckers to grow, even if you tack them down into the ground, all they're doing is zapping energy away from the apex and likely to kill off the apex. So I would recommend just going ahead and eliminating those suckers altogether right from the get-go. And again, because they're laterally oriented, the apexes are weak. To offset that and produce more strength in the apex, when you're pruning back azaleas, of course you take the suckers off, but you might want to prune the lower branches a little bit stronger, a little bit heavier than the apex of the tree. This will leave more green at the top of the tree, which is more of a photosynthetic surface, which feeds that portion, keeps it alive, keeps it healthy. This is also true for certain Japanese maple cultivars, particularly dwarf cultivars like Kashima, or interesting cultivars like Arakawa, rough bark Japanese maple. Their apexes tend to be weak, so that technique we talked about earlier of removing one leaf in each pair, you may not want to do that right to the very apex of the plant. You may only want to do it to the lower canopy, the lower branches on the tree, and again, that will help balance energy to some degree as well. So I actually remember at Fujikawa's place we had an Arakawa, very famous Arakawa Maple. Usually they're grafted on standard Acer palmatum rootstock. So this was beautifully done. It's probably 60 years old, 70 years old. The Nabari on the tree was like 2.5 feet across. It was huge. Wow. Perfect taper. It blended beautifully.
Was it just plated?
It was plated all the way around. Yeah,
wild.
it blended beautifully. Full canopy, absolutely gorgeous. First year I was there in the fall, it turned bright red, absolutely awesome. Ooh. The next year in the summer, the apex died.
Oh boy.
Yeah, and it was inevitable. It was going to happen at some point, and we were trying to offset that again by leaving all that foliage at the top and working, just removing the foliage at the bottom of the tree, or one leaf in each pair. But even with that, the tree had gotten to a point where, all right, that's just going to shed the apex, and it's an inevitability. It just happens.
Time for a new one.
It sucks. Yeah, it hurts. I mean, that was easily a 5-figure tree that just went poof. The value just dissipated instantly. Yeah, it sucks, but it's the nature of the beast, I guess.
Lesson in impermanence.
That's right. Lesson in impermanence. That's right.
Trees teach us.
That's right. Yes. All right. So I think that's going to do it for this episode of the Bonsai Network podcast. Did we forget anything?
I don't know. Did we talk about the tokonoma?
Oh, I guess we could throw that in here at the very end. So the tokonoma here behind us. We've done this setup a little differently. We've actually slid a little further back towards the tokonoma so you guys can see it a little bit better here. This tree behind me here is a Hinoki Cypress. This is a species that going into early June in the northern hemisphere here, this is a perfect time to start working on Hinokis. And we'll actually this coming week on BONSAI-U be featuring a dwarf Hinoki Cypress in the episode, so definitely check that out. But the tree behind me here is just a standard Chemacypris obtusa. This tree I actually did as a demonstration for the Memphis Bonsai Society like 7 or 8 years ago. And I liked the tree so much that after I finished the demo, I bought the tree from the club. They were going to, I think, raffle it off to the club, but I want the tree. So I bought the tree, brought it back to Knoxville, and then my dad took care of it while I was still in Japan. And then this spring, we actually potted it up in this Nakawatari container. So Nakawatari refers to pots made in China between the years 1800 and 1911. The reason it's 1911 is that's the end of the Meiji period, right at the start of the Taisho period in 1912. So in any case, this pot was made during that period, potted it up this spring, and then coming up here in the next week or so, I'll actually style this tree up and get it looking good. Yeah. So this is one of my favorite trees here. Just very soft, very elegant. It's one of those trees that I think, you hold on to it for a decade or 2 decades, it's going to look spectacular. It's one of those special plants, I think. And it's just field grown material.
I love this tree though. You've
it's
heard me talk about it before, but gosh, sexy tree. It is. It's got like a sassy hip swish is what I like to call it. and then she's got like this arm out for
it's like the geisha with their big sleeve that they hide stuff in.
Man.
Yeah, and then we've got a cool scroll behind there too. I don't know exactly what the scroll says or what it is. It looks sort of like Lao Tzu, the scholar from China, because he's got the big head.
Big brain time.
Exactly, but I don't know exactly if that's the case. And then we've got a cool little hut stone off to the side here that I picked up in Japan earlier this year. But I thought it was a good, sort of early summer display. It's kind of light and soft and nice.
Exactly. Fresh.
So we'll end the podcast on that note and send you guys on your way. I want to thank you guys for checking out this episode of the Bonsai Network podcast. If you like what we do here, of course, make sure to like and subscribe and follow us on all the platforms. And if you want to support us monetarily, click on the link in the description down below. It'll take you to my website and you can make a donation there. You can do $1, $5, $1,000, whatever you want. $1 million. Yeah, that would be fantastic. But in any case, we really appreciate all of your support. And until next time, take care.